My husband proposed to his first love at 70. My daughter betrayed me too, but I destroyed their wedding with secrets they hid for years. Early March in Boston brings a peculiar chill, not quite winter, not quite spring. That afternoon, gray clouds hung low over our colonial-style house in the suburbs, matching the coldness that had settled between us for months. I stood in our kitchen, methodically chopping vegetables for Harold's dinner, just as I had done for the past 45 years. The familiar rhythm of the knife against the cutting board was the only sound in our too-quiet home. From where I stood, I could see Harold in the living room. At 70, my husband still cut an impressive figure, tall, with a full head of silver hair that complemented his academic reputation. Professor Harold Sutton, respected authority in American literature, husband to Evelyn Parker, father to Samantha. But today, something was different. He wasn't reading his newspaper or grading papers. Instead, he sat rigidly on his favorite armchair, staring at his phone with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. "Evelyn?" He called out, his voice unnaturally controlled. "Could you come here for a moment?" I wiped my hands on my apron and walked into the living room, noticing how he didn't look up as I approached. "We should end this," Harold said flatly, finally raising his eyes to meet mine. "End what?" I asked, thinking he meant some trivial household matter or subscription. Without a word, he reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. From it, he extracted a document and placed it on the coffee table between us. The words, "Petition for Divorce," were printed in bold at the top, with today's date already filled in. "Loretta needs me." He continued, his voice devoid of emotion or apology, "and I want to spend whatever years I have left with her." I didn't collapse. I didn't scream. Instead, I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me. It wasn't heartbreak, I felt that would come later, but rather a stunning awareness of Harold's audacity. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Harold's lips twitched into what might have been a smile. "Since George died, I knew then I couldn't miss this second chance." George Quinn, Loretta's husband, the man had been dead barely 2 months. I was still processing this revelation when our front door opened. Samantha, our only daughter, strode in without knocking, a sleek designer coat draped over her slim frame. At 38, she was the spitting image of Harold, from her calculating gaze to her perfect posture. Behind her cold beauty lurked something I had never wanted to see: contempt. "Mom, you should start packing," she announced, dropping an empty suitcase at my feet. "Dad and Loretta are getting married this month. Don't make this difficult for everyone." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. My own daughter had been part of the planning, had chosen sides before I even knew there was a battle. 3 days later, a cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was an elegantly designed wedding invitation, and scrawled across the bottom in flowing script, "Thank you, Evelyn, for setting Harold free." The local papers ran the story the next day, a heartwarming tale of rekindled love between the distinguished Professor Sutton and celebrated novelist Loretta Quinn, reunited after 40 years apart. Their decades-long separation was portrayed as a tragic twist of fate, now gloriously rectified. No mention of the wife of 45 years being discarded like yesterday's newspaper. That evening, I stood before the bathroom mirror, really seeing myself for the first time in decades. The woman staring back at me was a stranger, pale, diminished, with eyes that had forgotten how to shine. When had I disappeared? When had Evelyn Parker become merely Harold's wife? I didn't cry. I didn't beg. Instead, I made a decision: I would attend their wedding. Not to create a scene or plead for my marriage, but to bless them in my own way. That night, while Harold slept in the guest room, I slipped into his study, a sanctuary I'd never been encouraged to enter. I began searching through his files, desk drawers, anywhere that might hold the truth about this sudden abandonment. In the bottom drawer of his desk, hidden behind a false panel, I discovered by chance, I found a stack of bank statements. As I flipped through them, one name appeared repeatedly: Loretta Quinn. Regular monthly transfers, significant amounts. But what made my blood run cold was the date of the first payment 12 years ago, when George Quinn was very much alive. As I stared at those bank statements, memories flooded back, memories I had tucked away for decades. I was 19 when Harold Sutton came into my life. He was 17, the son of my father's closest friend, orphaned overnight. When a truck veered across the center line on a rainy evening, my parents took him in without hesitation. Family helps family, my father had said. Though we weren't related by blood, Harold was brilliant. Everyone knew it. So when Harvard acceptance letter arrived with its insufficient scholarship offer, my father sold our last parcel of land, the fertile acres we'd been saving for my college fund. The boy has potential. Dad told me privately, he'll make something of himself. And so while Harold packed for Cambridge, I packed away my own college brochures. Someone needed to help with the farm, to care for our aging parents. Someone needed to stay. During his infrequent visits home, Harold was always sweet, always grateful. He'd sit beside me on the porch swing, his hand tentatively reaching for mine. "I'm coming back for you, Evelyn," he'd whisper. "I'll give you the life you deserve." In those moments, I believed him. I saw in his shy smile a boy who understood sacrifice. When he graduated at 25, he drove straight from Cambridge to our little farmhouse in his newly purchased Ford. He proposed that evening down on one knee in my mother's vegetable garden. I was 23 and had never traveled more than 50 miles from home. His promise of Boston, of adventure, of a life together seemed like salvation. The reality proved different. We moved to Boston, where Harold began his assistant professorship at a prestigious university. I kept our small apartment tidy, learned to cook dishes I'd never heard of, and tried to fit in with faculty wives who spoke of European vacations and summer homes. Harold grew increasingly distant, attending conferences and academic events without me. "You wouldn't enjoy it, Evelyn," he'd say, straightening his tie. "It's all shop talk and politics. You're better off at home." After a while, he stopped offering explanations altogether. I gave birth to Samantha when I was 32. By then, Harold was already a department chair, coming home later and later. Networking. He'd call it his breath, smelling of expensive scotch. I'd never tasted 15 years ago. Loretta Quinn's name began appearing in our conversations. Harold mentioned her casually at first, a former acquaintance who'd made a name for herself as a novelist, someone he'd reconnected with at a literary conference. "You should read her work, Evelyn," he'd suggested, though he never actually brought any of her books home. When he finally introduced us at a rare department function I was permitted to attend, I noticed the way his eyes lingered on her, how his hand rested too familiarly at the small of her back. Loretta was everything I wasn't: sophisticated, educated, accomplished. She looked through me as if I were wallpaper. Now, examining these financial records, everything clicked into place. Monthly payments labeled research collaboration, beginning 15 years ago, our 30th anniversary year. Nearly $500,000 over time, siphoned from accounts I didn't even know existed. I felt sick. For over a decade, I'd been living in a marriage that was nothing but a facade, a reluctant obligation kept up by a man who had moved on long ago. My daughter, just 23 when this began, must have known, or at least suspected. Yet she'd never breathed a word. Digging deeper through the files, I found evidence of at least 3 large cash withdrawals coinciding perfectly with Harold's academic conferences abroad. One receipt particularly stood out: a hotel bill from Paris dated 7 years ago, with 2 names on the reservation: Harold Sutton and Loretta Quinn. I leaned back in Harold's leather chair, my hands trembling. Direct confrontation would be pointless. Harold had always been able to outmaneuver me with words. I needed more evidence, a perfect plan. I needed help. Reaching for my phone, I scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in years. Richard Blake, my father's attorney. The man Harold had repeatedly dismissed as a small-town lawyer who doesn't understand sophisticated finance. Perhaps that was exactly the perspective I needed now. As I carefully returned the files to their hiding place, a small slip of paper fluttered to the floor. It was another bank receipt, but this one showed a transfer to someone named Lucas Reed. The name appeared again on several other documents, always in close proximity to transactions involving Loretta. Who was this person? And why was Harold sending him money, too? I spent the entire night in Harold's study methodically going through every statement, every receipt, every scribbled note. My eyes burned from fatigue, but a strange energy kept me going. The energy of someone who'd finally glimpsed the truth after years in darkness. The more I examined the financial trail, the more complex it became. Harold hadn't just been sending money to Loretta. There were substantial transfers to a trust fund under the name Lucas Reed. Some documents contained Harold's handwritten notations, LR, secured, and GQ, no suspicion. The initials GQ had to be George Quinn Loretta's late husband. I discovered patterns in the cash withdrawals, 5 major ones over the past decade, each around $20,000. What struck me was their timing. 3 coincided exactly with the release dates of Loretta's most successful novels. The other 2 aligned perfectly with George Quinn's hospitalizations as reported in literary news I'd found online. Was Harold financing Loretta's career, or was he paying to keep something hidden about George's condition? By dawn, I'd organized everything into a timeline that painted a damning picture. I heard Harold stirring upstairs, preparing for what would likely be one of his last days in our home. I made coffee as usual, steadying my nerves for what I was about to do. Harold. I began casually as he entered the kitchen. I was wondering about some financial matters before we proceed with your plans. He looked up from his phone, irritation flashing across his face. What matters? The regular payments to Loretta Quinn over the past 12 years, for instance. The coffee mug froze halfway to his lips. For a moment, genuine shock registered in his eyes before hardening into contempt. Don't meddle in affairs you don't understand, Evelyn. He snapped, his voice rising. These are academic matters between educated people. You're just a housewife. Don't make yourself look more foolish than necessary. His words stung, but they also revealed something important. He wasn't even trying to deny it. He truly believed I posed no threat, that I was too simple, too powerless to challenge him. Later that afternoon, Samantha arrived crisp and businesslike in her tailored suit. Without bothering with pleasantries, she placed a thick document on the kitchen table. This is the divorce settlement Dad's lawyer prepared, she said, sliding it toward me with manicured fingernails. You should sign it quickly for the sake of family dignity. I scanned the pages, my heart sinking. The settlement would leave me with almost nothing, just a small monthly allowance that barely exceeded Social Security benefits. Our home, our investments, even the antiques I'd carefully collected over the years, all would remain with Harold. You should know your place, Mom. Samantha added a hint of smugness in her voice. You've been living off Dad your whole life. This is no different. I looked at my daughter, trying to find some trace of the child I'd raised, but saw only Loretta's influence, calculated ambition without empathy. I'll think about it, I said quietly, knowing it would buy me time. The next morning, I visited our bank under the pretense of updating my personal accounts. The helpful young clerk pulled up our joint financial history, revealing what I'd suspected: Harold had been systematically transferring jointly owned assets to his private accounts for the past 6 months. He'd been planning this betrayal for longer than I'd imagined. As the clerk printed copies of the transactions I'd requested, she mentioned something that made my pulse quicken. Professor Sutton was here last week with a young man, she said, conversationally. They were finalizing some trust paperwork. His assistant, I think. Did you happen to catch his name? I asked, keeping my voice casual. Oh yes, He signed several documents. Lucas Reed, I believe. Polite young man, much nicer than the professor, if you don't mind my saying. I managed to obtain a copy of one document bearing Lucas Reed's signature before heading home, my mind racing with possibilities. Who was this man, and what role did he play in the web Harold and Loretta had woven? That evening, as I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by notes and copies, my laptop chimed with an incoming email. The sender's address was unfamiliar, just a string of random characters. The message was brief, but sent a chill down my spine. You're looking for me? Meet me at Café Larchmont, 10 a.m. tomorrow. L.R. Café Larchmont was tucked away in a quiet corner of South Boston, far from the academic circles Harold frequented. I arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a table near the back exit, a precaution that seemed sensible given the circumstances. The morning crowd was sparse. A couple of students with laptops, an elderly man reading a newspaper, a barista methodically wiping down the counter. I ordered a coffee I didn't want, and waited, my purse clutched tightly on my lap. Inside was a small recorder, another precaution. At precisely 10 a.m., the bell above the door chimed. A man in his early 30s entered, his gaze immediately finding mine, as if he'd known exactly who to look for. He wore simple clothes, jeans, a navy button-down, comfortable shoes, but carried himself with unmistakable confidence. His features were sharp, observant, with eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. Without hesitation, he approached my table and sat down across from me. "Mrs. Sutton," he said quietly, "I'm Lucas Reed." I studied him carefully. "You sent me that email." He nodded. "I've been watching you investigate. You're more thorough than they expected." "And who are you exactly?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "George Quinn's adopted nephew," he replied. "He raised me after my parents died in a boating accident when I was 11. I owe him everything." His expression hardened. "I know you're looking into Loretta and Harold. We have common enemies, Mrs. Sutton." For the next hour, Lucas Reed unfolded a story that turned my understanding of the situation upside down. George Quinn had been a successful publisher who fell madly in love with Loretta early in her career. He promoted her work, connected her with the right people, essentially building the foundation for her success. Uncle George worshipped the ground she walked on. Lucas said, his voice tinged with bitterness. But in his final years, he became increasingly depressed. He suspected she was having an affair but couldn't prove it. His health deteriorated rapidly. Lucas explained that as George's only living relative, he watched helplessly as his uncle suffered. "I had suspicions about Harold Sutton for years. I'd seen them together at literary events, exchanging glances that went beyond professional courtesy. But I had no proof, and Uncle George was already so broken." From his messenger bag, Lucas produced a manila envelope and a USB drive. "I've been gathering evidence since Uncle George died. Professional surveillance. Mostly, I have resources through my security consulting business." The envelope contained dozens of photos Harold and Loretta at hotels across the country, at conferences where they arrived separately but ended up in the same rooms. The timestamps on the photos went back 12 years, just as the bank statements had indicated. "There's more," Lucas said, plugging the USB drive into his laptop and turning it so I could see. He played a recording of Loretta speaking on the phone, clearly unaware she was being recorded. "Harold's funds will support the new book launch." Her voice came through clearly. "He doesn't realize how expensive this gets. But it doesn't matter. The old fool thinks he's investing in our future, as if I'd ever actually need his academic connections at this point." New. I felt sick listening to her cold calculation. "George died of heart failure," Lucas said quietly, stopping the recording. "But Loretta's betrayal killed him long before his heart stopped beating." When I asked why Lucas was sharing this with me, his answer surprised me. "I don't want money," he said firmly. Uncle George left me well provided for in his will, which he changed just 3 months before he died, cutting Loretta out completely. That's why she's rushing to secure Harold now. Her cash flow problem has become urgent. He leaned forward. I want justice for my uncle. And the more I've learned about Loretta's schemes, the more I realized you deserve justice too. Lucas revealed something that hit me like a physical blow. Loretta isn't just using Harold, she's using your daughter too. He produced a trust agreement with Samantha's signature. The document named her as the trustee for assets that would effectively transfer from Harold to Loretta while maintaining a veneer of family connection. You're not just being betrayed by your husband, Lucas said bluntly. You're being betrayed by your daughter too. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Samantha's sudden appearance with the divorce papers, her insistence that I sign quickly, her unfamiliar coldness. It wasn't just family loyalty to her father. She was an active participant in the scheme. Lucas had one final revelation. Loretta planned to marry Harold even while Uncle George was alive. She only backed off when George discovered some evidence and threatened divorce. After he changed his will and then conveniently died 3 months later, she wasted no time reconnecting with Harold. We spent another hour strategizing, Lucas, and I agreed not to reveal our evidence immediately. The most devastating moment to expose them would be at their wedding, and, at Loretta's major book signing scheduled the following day, I would contact Richard Blake, the lawyer Harold had always dismissed, to prepare legal action regarding the improper asset transfers. As we prepared to leave, Lucas handed me a small voice recorder. One more thing you should hear, he said grimly. This contains a conversation between Loretta and your daughter, Samantha. You should prepare yourself. I drove home from the cafe in a daze, the small voice recorder clutched in my hand like a live grenade. Harold had left a note saying he'd be staying at a hotel until the transition was complete, a small mercy that allowed me the privacy I needed. Sitting at the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of family meals, I pressed play with trembling fingers. Loretta Quinn's voice emerged smooth and controlled with undertones of calculation I'd never noticed before. Samantha, all you need to do is get your mother to sign the divorce papers. I'll handle everything else. As long as I keep my share, you can do whatever you want with the old man. My daughter's voice was cold, businesslike, a stranger's voice. Their conversation continued, detailing how they would divide Harold's assets, how Samantha would serve as the legal bridge, allowing Loretta to control most of Harold's wealth through a family trust. Samantha laughed when Loretta described how easily Harold had been manipulated into believing the arrangement was his idea. My stomach turned when Samantha referred to her father as the old man, again discussing him like an asset to be managed rather than a parent who had raised her. Even worse was how they discussed me as an inconvenient obstacle, a piece of furniture that needed to be cleared away. Just keep playing the concerned daughter. Loretta advised, she's always been desperate for your approval. I stopped the recording, unable to bear any more images flooded my mind. Samantha sitting beside me on the couch, patting my hand while saying, Dad deserves happiness. Mom. Samantha bringing me tea, encouraging me to think of the family reputation, while urging me to sign papers she'd helped draft. Each memory transformed from comfort to betrayal. She hadn't supported Harold out of some misguided loyalty or belief in true love. She was actively colluding with Loretta for money and connections. Loretta had promised to help advance Samantha's publishing career in exchange for her assistance. The next morning, Lucas emailed me a complete copy of the trust agreement. The document was cleverly constructed. Samantha would serve as trustee for assets that would functionally belong to Loretta, disguised as family planning for Harold's new marriage. A clause buried in the legal jargon specifically prevented me from challenging the arrangement if I agreed to the divorce. Amicably, I contacted Richard Blake immediately. Though retired, he agreed to meet me at his home office that afternoon. Richard had been my father's attorney and friend for decades. Harold had always dismissed him as a small-town lawyer, but Richard's lack of pretension concealed a razor-sharp legal mind. As I spread the documents across his desk, Richard's expression grew increasingly grave. He recognized the trap Harold and Samantha had laid immediately. They've created a nearly perfect financial fortress, he said, adjusting his reading glasses as he examined the trust agreement. Nearly perfect, but not quite. There are vulnerabilities we can exploit. He looked up at me with determined eyes. We need to turn public opinion into a weapon, Evelyn, but we must strike at exactly the right moment. Over the next 2 hours, we developed a multi-pronged strategy. First, send a formal letter demanding the trust agreement be voided as it violated the rights of a legal spouse. Second, gather additional evidence of Harold misappropriating research funds to personally finance Loretta. And third, prepare lawsuit documentation if Harold and Loretta refuse to negotiate. The court of public opinion moves faster than any legal court. Richard reminded me, that's where we'll win this battle. Taking his advice, I made a discreet visit to Meridian Publishing, which had once worked with Loretta and was planning to publish her next book. I met with a senior editor under the pretense of discussing a potential memoir. Once in her office, I revealed that Loretta Quinn was involved in a financial and ethical scandal that would soon become public. I can't divulge details yet, I explained, but as someone who's been connected to Ms. Quinn's career, I felt you should be prepared. The editor's expression remained professionally neutral, but her eyes betrayed concern. We would need concrete evidence before reconsidering our relationship with Ms. Quinn, she said carefully, but I appreciate the courtesy of your warning. That evening, Samantha called. Her voice dripped with false concern. Mom, I hope you're doing all right with all this change, she began. I'm just checking in to see if you've had time to review those papers. I'm reviewing quite a lot of papers these days, Samantha. I replied evenly. Don't make this difficult, Mom. She sighed. There's no point fighting Dad and Loretta, you won't win. The audacity of her betrayal gave me a strange cold strength. You should worry about yourself, Samantha, before you get pulled down into the swamp with those two. There was a long pause before she hung up without another word. 2 days before the wedding, an unmarked envelope was slipped under my door. Inside was a photograph of Loretta meeting with an unknown man at what appeared to be a secluded restaurant. They sat close together, her hand resting intimately on his arm. On the back of the photo was a handwritten note. Loretta doesn't just have Harold. The wedding day arrived with picture-perfect weather, sunny skies that would photograph beautifully for the society pages. How appropriate for what the media was calling a fairy tale reunion. Lucas, Richard, and I had spent the past 48 hours meticulously organizing our evidence and preparing our strategy. Remember, Richard had advised, timing is everything. Let them reach the height of their triumph before we strike. I had discreetly sent special invitations to selected journalists known for covering upper-class scandals disguised as honored guest invitations. I knew from Harold's academic career which reporters had the sharpest teeth behind their professional smiles. For the occasion, I chose an elegant navy dress that I'd purchased years ago but never worn. Harold had deemed it too formal for a professor's wife. My hair was freshly styled, my makeup subtle but carefully applied. I would not appear as the dowdy, discarded wife they expected. The grand ballroom of the Belmont Hotel glittered with Boston's intellectual elite. Crystal chandeliers reflected off champagne flutes as the room buzzed with admiration for the destined lovers. Loretta Quinn, resplendent in ivory silk, that tastefully acknowledged this wasn't her first marriage, worked the room like the celebrity she was. Harold stood beside her, more animated than I'd seen him in years, basking in reflected glory. Samantha led the bridesmaids in matching burgundy dresses, her face alight with triumph as she spotted me entering alone. The slight narrowing of her eyes told me she hadn't expected me to actually attend good. The ceremony proceeded with practiced elegance. When the reception began, I waited patiently through the toasts and the first dance. As the MC announced, "And now a few words from family members," I rose from my seat and walked confidently to the stage. Harold's face froze mid-smile. Loretta's hand tightened visibly around her champagne flute. "For those who don't know me," I began pleasantly, "I'm Evelyn Parker, Harold's wife of 45 years. Until very recently," murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I wanted to personally congratulate the happy couple and share some memories." I removed my phone from my purse and connected it to the projection system that had been displaying tasteful photos of the couple. The room fell silent as Loretta's voice filled the space. "Harold's funds will support the new book launch. The old fool thinks he's investing in our future." The screen displayed financial records highlighting transfers from Harold's research accounts to Loretta dating back 12 years. I narrated calmly, "These payments began while George Quinn was still alive, while I was still believed I was in a faithful marriage." Next came photographs of Harold and Loretta together at hotels across the country, all meticulously dated, then the trust documents bearing Samantha's signature. "This is the agreement my daughter helped create to transfer Harold's assets, our marital assets, to Loretta through a family trust that specifically excludes me." The ballroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Phones emerged from pockets and purses, capturing every moment. Harold lunged toward the stage, face contorted with rage. "Evelyn, stop this immediately!" he shouted, but his authority held no power anymore. Loretta dramatically slumped in her chair, a hand to her forehead in a well-practiced feint that didn't quite reach her calculating eyes. Samantha rushed toward me, pale-faced with fury. "Security," she called, trying to grab my arm, but the hotel staff hesitated, unsure who to support in this unexpected spectacle. "I've shared copies of all this evidence with several journalists in this room," I announced calmly. "I believe there are some questions you might want to ask the happy couple." As I stepped off the stage, chaos erupted. Reporters converged on Harold and Loretta, cameras flashed, guests huddled in shocked clusters. I walked steadily through the crowd and out the grand doors, my head held high. By evening, social media was ablaze with images and videos from the wedding. "Centuries love story or elaborate fraud," read one headline. Meridian Publishing released a statement that Loretta Quinn's upcoming book release would be postponed pending review of author conduct concerns. But I wasn't finished. The following day, Loretta attempted damage control with a hastily arranged, scaled-down book signing at a loyal independent bookstore. The crowd was smaller than anticipated, but still substantial. Some genuine fans, others drawn by the scandal. As Loretta began her practice speech about literary passion, Lucas Reed emerged from the crowd. Using the bookstore's own projection equipment, he played another damning recording. Loretta speaking intimately with the mystery man from the photograph. "Harold is just insurance." Her voice echoed through the shocked store. "Once the divorce is final and the assets are transferred, we'll have options. I always keep a backup plan." Loretta's composure finally shattered. Before a dozen recording phones, she lunged at Lucas, screaming accusations that only confirmed her guilt. The cultivated image of literary dignity collapsed, completely replaced by the raw fury of a woman whose schemes were exposed. That evening, my phone rang. Harold's name appeared on the screen. I answered calmly, "Evelyn." He said, his voice quivering with a desperation I'd never heard before. "What do you want? We can negotiate." I smiled, savoring the moment. "Now it's my turn to set the terms, Harold." After hanging up, I poured myself a glass of wine, feeling a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in decades. Just as I was about to take a sip, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Be careful, they won't let this go so easily." The week following my twin strikes at the wedding and book signing was a whirlwind of media frenzy. Harold and Loretta's love story for the ages transformed overnight into Boston's most salacious scandal. News outlets that had previously gushed about their destined reunion now dissected every aspect of their deception. Photographs of their stunned faces at the wedding became memes across social media. The academic community, Harold's sanctuary for decades, acted swiftly. The university board announced a special committee to investigate the misappropriation of research funds. Within days, they suspended Harold's emeritus status and revoked his Distinguished Teaching Award. His name was quietly removed from the departmental website where it had once dominated the faculty listings. Loretta's fall was equally dramatic. 3 publishers terminated her contracts, citing moral character clauses. Bookstores pulled her novels from featured author displays. Literary awards committees issued statements reconsidering previous honors. The readers who had once waited in line for her autograph now denounced her on reader forums and book review sites. 10 days after the wedding debacle, Harold requested a formal meeting. Richard Blake accompanied me to a neutral law office downtown, where Harold sat waiting with his own attorney, a younger, less confident man than I had expected. Harold had aged visibly in those 10 days. The lines around his mouth had deepened, and the self-assured posture of academia's golden boy had crumpled into the hunched shoulders of a man under siege. "Kick Evelyn," he began stiffly. "I believe we can resolve this situation without further public displays." Richard placed our counter-proposal on the table. "My client's terms are straightforward. Our demands were clear: dissolution of the fraudulent trust, equal division of all marital assets per Massachusetts law, plus additional compensation for emotional distress and legal fees, and a public apology acknowledging his deception." Harold's attorney scanned the document, whispering urgently to his client. Harold's face flushed with the indignation I'd witnessed countless times over our marriage. "This is extortion," he snapped. "I built my career and earned every penny while she sacrificed her own education to support you," Richard interjected coolly. "While she managed your household, raised your child, and fulfilled social obligations that advanced your career. The courts recognize these contributions, Professor, and they'll take particular interest in the documented misuse of university funds." Harold felt silent defeat settling over him like a shroud. "Loretta wanted me to relay a message," he finally said, his voice hollow. "She suggests you should consider your position carefully. There are other matters that could emerge if pushed." I smiled, the calm confidence in my voice. Surprising even me. I already have all her secrets. I just haven't needed to use them all yet. Samantha's situation deteriorated rapidly. Her attempt at damage control, a lengthy social media post calling me a vindictive woman, deliberately destroying her father's happiness, backfired spectacularly. The hashtag #ungrateful daughter trended briefly as strangers dissected her betrayal. Her publishing house employer quietly terminated her position, citing restructuring. Former colleagues and friends vanished from her life, unwilling to associate with such public toxicity. Richard and I weren't quite finished. We released one final recording, a conversation where Loretta and Samantha discussed plans to place me in a nursing home against my will if I refused to sign the divorce papers. The public's reaction was swift and merciless. One talk show host called Samantha America's worst daughter. Several women's advocacy groups reached out, inviting me to share my story of resilience and empowerment. After 2 weeks of unrelenting pressure, Harold capitulated completely. He signed our agreement without further negotiation. Beyond the equal division of assets, I received our summer property in Vermont, substantial cash compensation, and shares in investments I hadn't even known existed. Loretta's empire continued to crumble. The IRS opened an investigation into her finances after anonymous tips, courtesy of Lucas, about unreported income. Former literary associates distanced themselves, unwilling to risk their reputations. She was forced to sell her elegant Boston brownstone to cover mounting legal debts. One evening, as I was packing books in my soon-to-be former home, my phone rang with Samantha's number. I almost didn't answer, but some maternal instinct made me pick up. Mom. Her voice cracked no longer, confident or commanding. I was wrong about everything. I've lost my job. My friends. No one will even speak to me. A sob caught in her throat. Can you help me, please? The pain in her voice stirred something in me, but not pity. I thought of the daughter I had raised, the one who had called me an obstacle, who had plotted to institutionalize her own mother. I gave you everything for 38 years, Samantha. I replied, my voice gentle but firm. Now you'll live with the choices you made. I blocked her number immediately afterward, closing the chapter on a mother-daughter relationship that had become poisoned beyond salvation. 2 days later, while organizing papers for my move to Vermont, discovered an old envelope tucked inside a family Bible. Inside was a yellowed letter from my father to Harold, written shortly before Dad's death. As I unfolded it, the first line made my blood run cold. Son, I entrusted you with my greatest treasure, my daughter, and I fear you have failed to recognize her worth. Winter was fading when I finally left Boston, as the moving truck pulled away from the house where I'd spent 4 decades. I felt none of the grief I'd expected, only a light-hearted anticipation I hadn't experienced since youth Vermont welcomed me with rolling hills and a quiet dignity that soothed my spirit. The vacation home Harold and I had purchased years ago but rarely visited now became my sanctuary. The property sat on 12 acres of abandoned farmland with a stone cottage that had weathered a century of New England seasons. You should sell it and buy something more practical. Richard had advised when we finalized the divorce settlement. I had smiled already, envisioning what it would become. This is exactly what I need. Over the spring months, I transformed the land. With my settlement money, I hired local contractors to renovate the cottage and build a small restaurant addition. With a commercial kitchen, I planted my first vegetable garden since leaving my father's farm 50 years earlier, surprised at how naturally my hands remembered the feel of soil. When summer arrived, I opened Second Bloom, a farm-to-table cafe serving traditional recipes from my childhood. The name felt right, a declaration that life could flourish again after decades of dormancy. My story had traveled beyond Boston. Sometimes visitors would arrive hesitantly asking if I was that Evelyn Parker. Rather than hiding from it, I embraced my unexpected notoriety. Women my age or older would sit at my corner table sharing stories of marriages where they'd disappeared into the shadows of demanding husbands. I read about what you did. One silver-haired woman told me over apple pie. I left Robert after 42 years. If you could stand up at 70, I could do it at 68. 6 months after opening, a national magazine published a feature, Evelyn Parker, the woman who refused to fall at 70. The writer captured what I'd come to understand myself, that my story resonated because it challenged the assumption that women of a certain age should accept invisibility and betrayal as inevitable. News of my former family reached me occasionally. Harold had moved to a small academic community in the Midwest, where he'd taken a part-time teaching position at a community college, a crushing step down for a man who'd once lectured internationally. His health had deteriorated, his previously commanding presence diminished by scandal and stress. Loretta's fall had been even more precipitous. Blacklisted by American publishers following revelations about financial impropriety, she'd relocated to Europe, reportedly living modestly off dwindling royalties from international editions of her earlier works. Samantha had suffered the most complete reversal. Unemployable in publishing, abandoned by the social circles she'd cultivated, She'd moved to a rundown apartment in a suburban area far from the prestigious Boston address she'd once flaunted. One autumn morning at the farmer's market where I sold my organic vegetables, I looked up to see a thin, pallid figure standing at the edge of the crowd. Samantha, her designer clothes replaced by shabby jeans and a worn jacket, watched me from a distance. Our eyes met across the market square. She took a tentative step forward, but I simply shook my head once gently and turned away. No words were necessary. The daughter who had plotted against me had no place in this new life I'd built. That winter, I enrolled in business management courses at the local community college, fulfilling the dream of education I'd sacrificed decades ago. At 71, I was easily the oldest student in the class, but found my life experience gave me insights the younger students lacked. Lucas Reed visited occasionally, bringing news or simply helping around the farm. We'd developed a comfortable friendship, both of us having escaped the shadows cast by Harold and Loretta. Sometimes we'd sit on my porch watching the sunset, content in shared silence that required no explanations. Almost a year to the day after the wedding that never was, I received an invitation that made me laugh out loud when I opened it. The Women's Studies Department at Harold's former university was hosting a symposium on independence and rights of older women, and wanted me as a keynote speaker. Standing at the podium in the grand lecture hall where Harold had once told me I didn't belong, I surveyed the attentive faces, students, faculty, community members, all there to hear what I had to say. Years ago, I began. I was told this place wasn't for me. Today I stand here not because anyone granted me permission, but because I've earned the right. The applause that followed was validation I'd never imagined receiving. That evening, I returned to my farm, settling into the porch chair that had become my favorite spot for reflection. Before me stretched rows of vegetables beginning their spring growth. Inside the cafe weekend, guests laughed and chatted over fresh-baked bread and hearty stew. I sipped my tea, contemplating the journey that had brought me here. A smile played across my lips as I thought, they took my youth, but I've reclaimed my life. As twilight settled over the Vermont hills, I felt a sense of peace and liberation I'd never known before. Evelyn Parker, no longer defined as Harold's wife or Samantha's mother, had finally emerged as herself.